I cannot tell you how excited I am about having the opportunity to introduce Hazel Carby after this extraordinary day of insightful, provocative, brilliant presentations, and an audience, by the way, that's filled with people who could have also been presenters. I mean, it's just amazing to have everyone come out, but it's also a testimony to Hazel and to the admiration that we all have for her. Professor Carby is the Charles C. and Dorothea S. Dilley Professor of African American Studies, Professor of American Studies, and Director of the Initiative on Race, Gender, and Globalization at Yale University. She earned her BA from Portsmouth Polytechnic and her PhD from Birmingham University in England in 1984. As a graduate student, she co-edited The Empire Strikes Back, Race and Racism in 70s Britain. After 7 years of teaching at Wesleyan University, in 1989, Hazel came to Yale, and you cannot imagine how thrilled those of us who were graduate students were. We were waiting for Hazel. Saidia can attest to that. We were so excited that she was coming. She transformed our experience there. There, at Yale, she chaired the historic African American Studies program and fought for and directed that program's transition to departmental status. And you know that that was not an easy feat. Well before the publication of Reconstructing Womanhood, Hazel Carby made a name for herself as a significant intellectual, a new voice, courageous, fierce, and undaunted, someone whose timely interventions into African American studies and women's studies would help to strengthen both of those emerging fields. White Women Listen, Black Feminism, and the Boundaries of Sisterhood, On the Threshold of the Women's Era, Lynching, Empire, and Sexuality and Feminist Theory, It Just Bees That Way Sometime, The Sexual Politics of Women's Blues. All of these essays introduced us to Hazel Carby. Her intellectual project has consistently called upon those two fields, African American studies and women's studies, to critically examine their own myopia around the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and nation. And on the threshold of the women's era, she redefined a period that had been known to us as the era of Du Bois and Washington by inserting the voices of Ida B. Wells, Anna Julia Cooper, Pauline Hopkins. But as she reminded us, she did not do so to, quote, merely in order to insert women into the gaps in our cultural history, to compete for intellectual dominance with men, but to shift the object of interpretation from examples of individual genius to the collective production and interrelation of forms of knowledge among Black women intellectuals. At the same time, in the essay, she marked the continuity between her project and that of the women about whom she wrote. Both confronted a women's movement, feminist theory, women's studies, whose concern focused on white, middle-class, quote, inhabitants of the metropoles, unquote, and in so doing, supported and reproduced racist hierarchies. This is a project upon which Hazel would elaborate more fully in the book that brings us together today, Reconstructing Womanhood. In the opening pages of that book, Carby challenged the project of Black feminist criticism by encouraging us to see the nascent discourse as, quote, a problem, not a solution, a sign that should be interrogated, a locus of contradictions. That has got to be one of the most often quoted lines in all of Black feminist criticism. While that book focuses on the ideological dimensions and political work of 19th century Black women novelists, in its last pages it turns its attention to another of Hazel's concerns, Black women, Black people in 20th century urban contexts. And here she takes up the challenge she presents in the opening pages. She addresses an emerging canon of Black women's writing, one that celebrated the folk origins of Black women's fiction. What if, Hazel asks us, in addition to Zora Neale Hurston's examinations of and romanticizations of folk, of a Southern rural folk, what if we also included Nella Larson, Jessie Fawcett, Ann Petrie, and their representation of women in the urban context? How do we represent the souls of Black folk? What are the myriad messy complexities involved in that project? These closing pages, entitled The Quicksands of Representation, look forward to Carby's essays, Policing the Black Woman's Body in an Urban Context, and It Just Bees That Way Sometimes, The Sexual Politics of Women's Blues, where she offered a critique of the limitations of her earlier work that focused on elite, educated Black women intellectuals. In these two essays, Carby first turned to organic intellectuals, the blues queens, and second, to efforts to discipline Black women's existence on the urban landscape. And throughout, her materialist analysis has always grounded her theorizing about and her discussions of Black cultural production, whether it be in literature, film, or music. If Reconstructing Womanhood focused on Black women intellectuals, Race Men turned its attention to the historical construction of race men, as well as the historical and contemporary understandings of the Black intellectual as one who is male. As Carby argued, the intellectual work of Black women, and this is a quotation from Carby, the intellectual work of Black women and gay men is not thought to be of enough significance to be engaged with, argued with, agreed, or disagreed with. The book provided an examination of 20th century masculinities in literature, political commentary, film, photography, and music by focusing on iconographic figures such as Paul Robeson, Muddy Waters, Miles Davis, Samuel Delaney, Danny Glover, Cornel West, and Essex Hemphill. Cultures in Babylon, Black Britain, and African America gathered a collection of 20 years of Hazel's work, providing us access to important essays covering sexuality, the blues, multiculturalism, and feminism. And while Carby's work has consistently challenged Black feminist theory, African American studies, women's studies, and the elite white academy, she has also been a primary voice insisting upon a scholarship that situates African American studies in a larger context of the Black diaspora, and insisting that it engage contemporary forms of globalization and its impact upon Black identities, cultures, and politics. But on a more personal note, let me say, few scholars have been more important to my own work than has Hazel Carby. As a graduate student, I had the privilege of learning from and working with her. As a member of my dissertation committee, she helped shape what will become my first book. And since that time, her work has informed a number of my own projects in African American studies, American literature, and jazz studies. It seems every time I sit down to write about a subject that has long been on my mind, Hazel has already written on it. Insightfully, already opened a door, provided a vocabulary, set a framework for the discussions to follow. And as a Black woman, and I dare say I speak for many of us in this audience, as Black women in the elite academy, Hazel's example has often been a model for those of us who followed her. I often think we have watched her as she navigated that rocky terrain with the same fierce devotion and biting analysis that has informed her work. And when and where she entered, we entered with her. Fierce, audacious, passionate, generous, writer, critic, theorist, activist, and institution builder also. My colleague, my teacher, my friend, the brilliant Hazel Carby.
To say thank you to Tina and to Saidia doesn't even begin to describe how grateful I am to them, to Kalila, to Anne, and to Lisa, to Ronaldo, and to Robert for giving these brilliant papers today that I try and have to follow. But I also wanted to say that I hope all of you who know me know that I also think of this education journey as very much a collective one. That every time I'm in seminars with you or read your essays or pages of your dissertations or your books, I've just learnt so much in conversation with you. Every time I walk out of a classroom, I come away with these extraordinary gifts of ideas. So thank you, all of you. Our authenticity resides in the struggles of our present. Michelle Rolfe Trujillo. I am continually modifying my understanding of what it means to be a child of empire as I discover, rediscover, and rewrite the intersecting and interdependent worlds of empire that produced my parents. Whatever volcanic fault lines or fissures eventually divided them when they were living together in the imperial homeland as adults, in the places and the spaces before they met, they were each schooled into understandings of imperial British subjecthood, understandings that they shared despite the geographical distance between Britain and Jamaica. The Britishness of my parents was realized as a structure of ethics and value which seemed to have particular ideas about empire at their centre. It was very important to my mother that she was born in Wales, despite the fact that she grew up in Somerset in the southwest of England. The daughter of an agricultural labourer, my mother chose to be Welsh rather than English. Living in London, as we did all throughout my childhood, she would often assert this allegiance to Wales, regaling my brother and I with tales of the heroic Owen Glendower, born in 1359, declared Prince of Wales in 1400, and crowned Owen IV, King of Wales, in 1404. He raised a Welsh army in revolt against English domination and for years successfully fought the armies of the English king, Henry IV. I never knew when Glendower and the Welsh were defeated, as their defeat was never spoken of. But I did grow up with the distinct idea that we lived on the wrong side of the border between England and Wales. In 1969, when I was an undergraduate, the entire nation was glued to its television sets to watch the spectacular ceremony of the formal investiture of Prince Charles, son of Queen Elizabeth II, as Prince of Wales within the medieval walls of Carnarvon Castle. It occurred to me then, as it occurs to me now, that when I was growing up, Prince Charles was never referred to as the Prince of Wales in our house, though he had carried the title since he was born. Refusing to be English did not prevent my mother from being British. She had vivid memories of everyone in her school and community participating in the annual celebrations of Empire Day in her youth, occasions when even the most marginal members of small, poor, rural communities felt themselves connected to and part of a much larger world. When I remember what my mother told me about Empire Day celebrations, I recognize them as significant sites for producing multiple meanings of Britishness. Whatever she learnt about Britishness through this schooling formed the core of an ethical code and basis of judgment, which, although never explicitly articulated as a coherent whole, punctuated her attempts to provide her offspring with guidelines for living our lives. My mother deeply regretted the fact that Empire Day had disappeared by the time my brother and I were of school age. She mined her memories in order to reproduce in our lives the sense of inclusion, communal ethics, and value we obviously lacked. Her descriptions of Empire Day usually concluded with recitations from Rudyard Kipling's poem, If. She would purse her lips in an effort of recall, tilt her head on one side until she found the words she wanted, and begin. If you can keep your head while all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. The recitations became so familiar that my mind would wander. I have no memory of the middle part of the poem. Maybe she even skipped large chunks of it. Anyway, a quick turn of her head and a sharp glance was all it took to have my full attention back to the last lines delivered slowly and deliberately. Yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and, which is more, you'll be a man, my son. These words, learnt by rote in my mother's classroom, were transmitted as valued and valuable knowledge to my brother and I, in order to help us negotiate the present and prepare us for the future. They were words offered but not received as gifts. The childhood of those in my mother's generation, she was born in 1920, was saturated by the imperialism and class divisions of the Edwardian age. Empire Day was instituted in schools in 1902 when textbooks focused increasingly on the benefits of spreading trade and civilization. Imperialism, as it was experienced at home, worked to glue together a society which was otherwise sharply divided by class. As Bill Woods, a working-class labourer from Bristol, describes his childhood, they used to encourage us to be proud of the flag, salute the flag when we was at school. Yes, I was proud of being British. We was always taught to be proud of the Queen and the King. We was the people of the world, wasn't us? My mother's immediate and extended working-class family migrated from the city of Bristol to Wales and to the southwest, and they all expressed this pride and worldly sense. They never spoke of the fact, did they even know, that Bristol became a wealthy and international city because of the transatlantic trade in enslaved black bodies. I'm a great fan of the novels, if not the politics, of P.D. James, who, like my mother, was also born in 1920, but unlike her, was a child of the middle classes. James's father, a middle-level civil servant, had served as an officer in World War I. My grandfather also served in World War I, but as a private in the infantry, and when he left the military, he returned to the life of an agricultural labourer. P.D. James may have been raised within the same national borders as my mother, but the material conditions of her life separated and insulated her from the poverty that characterised the rural world of my mother or the urban England of Bill Woods's Bristol working class. Nevertheless, P.D. James, looking back on her childhood from her 80s, also describes how the shared imaginary of a British community as people of the world was represented on the walls of her Ludlow school. A map, she says, was permanently displayed in the largest double classroom with its splurges of red: Canada, India, Australia, New Zealand. Its small islands, like splashes of blood in all the oceans of the world, enabled our teacher to point out that this was, in truth as well as legend, an empire on which the sun never set. Empire Day was a notable event, celebrated with a march around the playground and a salute to the flag. For P.D. James, in a 21st century act of recall, the British-owned territories of the West Indies remain unnamed and unrecognised, just some, quote, small islands like splashes of blood in the oceans of the world. This reference to blood, appropriately, if unconsciously, colours the islands of the empire, an archipelago of labour camps where blood-soaked cane fields and factories were the source of her family's supply of sugar. But neither P.D. James, Bill James, nor my mother would ever have been reminded of blood each time they stirred a spoonful of sugar into their cups of tea. Celebrations of Empire Day during the month of May predominate in memories of schooling in oral histories of the 1920s, the wearing of rosettes of red, white and blue, the singing of I Vow to Thee, My Country, or Blake's Jerusalem, or the national songs of Scotland, Ireland, Wales and England, readings from the Bible and patriotic speeches by a Lord Mayor, counselling his listeners to be wise rulers of men in the far-flung empire. While children in Britain were wearing red, white and blue, marching around their respective playgrounds, singing anthems and saluting the Union Jack, my dad in Jamaica, like children all over the West Indies, the British West Indies, was also marching, singing the same songs and pledging allegiance on exactly the same day. P.D. James, my mother, and Bill Woods were addressed, despite their different class and gender locations, not only as people of the world, but as wise rulers of men. Jamaican, Barbadian, or Trinidadian children marched around their school playground, if their school had one, and to the main town to be lectured by some prominent person about their civic duties. In Growing Up Stupid Under the Union Jack, Austin Clarke describes how, as a child in Barbados, he was schooled to be the English of Little England, little black Englishmen, scrubbed clean with bars of Pears soap, wrapped in labels bearing the history of Lord Nelson, the hero of Trafalgar. Clarke remembers, Nelson had been dead for hundreds of years, but every small boy in Barbados giggled in the suds of his memory and history. Some years ago, on a visit to my parents' house, I found my dad reading a collection of 19th century English poetry. He had been rummaging around in the books I had acquired during my years as an undergraduate, books abandoned by me when I left to live in the United States, books my parents had carefully transported to the city of York when they moved from London 12 years ago. My dad told me that he was reading two of his favourite poems, Elegy Written in a Country Graveyard by Thomas Gray and Oliver Goldsmith's The Deserted Village. I didn't know that these were his favourite poems. I had never even had a conversation with my father about English poetry, not even during the years I was reading English in college. I was always mailing him books about race and biographies of black lives. He would devour them and we would talk about them. Through gifts, I was always trying to drag him into my world of race. And here he was, reading and rereading Thomas Gray. I noticed that this poetry was always next to his chair. Now it is next to his bed. I didn't ask him why this poetry was important to him, why he loved it so, or what connections he was making. I don't know why I didn't ask. Those born in Jamaica in the 1920s, like my dad, are at the tail end of the second generation of freedmen. Not granted the vote until 1944, they nevertheless volunteered to fight in 2 world wars. Not just for the British, but as British. My dad was among the first of those in Jamaica to volunteer to join the RAF, and in 1943 he was transported from Kingston to New York by sea and then across land to a Commonwealth Air Training Base in Moncton, New Brunswick, Canada. If you look up histories of the Commonwealth Air Training Plans, you will find stories of the brave white Canadian, New Zealanders, Australians, and South Africans who willingly risked their lives to rally to Britain's aid in her darkest hour. You will find no reference to anyone from the Caribbean. Nevertheless, my father and other West Indian volunteers, schooled as British subjects, were in Moncton training as the pilots, navigators, and wireless operators who eventually flew bombers and fighter planes from the UK into the heart of Europe. The erasure of the presence of my dad and other West Indians in New Brunswick lies layered upon other erasures of British history on the same soil. The erasure of a series of broken promises. Promises made by the British to the 3,500 black loyalists in 1783 and 2,000 black refugees from the War of 1812, who came with nothing to nowhere, who the British transported and then landed with indifference in the maritime provinces, without money, without provisions, plonked on rocky, thorny land, soon laced with infant skeletons, so poor they supposedly didn't even have a history. As my father's mind fragments from dementia, much of his 65 years of living in the UK since the war, and all sense of the present, dissolves, while the years of his youth in Jamaica and service in the RAF return for us both. He can still recite his RAF number. Tracing the books my father read in his Kingston classrooms, I find copies of the Royal Readers that he remembers. Royal Readers were texts used to school imperial subjects all over the empire. In Royal Readers number 5 is Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard by Thomas Gray and The Deserted Village by Oliver Goldsmith. Every story is by definition unfaithful. Reality can't be told or repeated. The only thing that can be done with reality is to invent it again. Tomás Eloy Martínez, Santa Evita. My education is and isn't a product of the disorderly year of 1968. A year fissured by contradictions that have long since been paved under a seamless cultural mythology of student rebellion. I was an undergraduate between 1967 and 1970, reading for a degree in English and history, steeped in Marxist theory, from a talented progressive faculty at what was then Portsmouth Polytechnic and is now Portsmouth University. I was an eager student in 1967, a successful student, if exam results are the measure of success. But my schooling so far had filled me with questions that were not answered. I was remarkably unaware that most of what I thought I already knew, information that I could regurgitate at a moment's notice, I was going to have to unlearn if I was going to know anything. The city of Portsmouth was not a university town. It suffered from neglect. It was decaying. In the late 60s, bomb damage from World War II was still evident, and unexploded ordnance still being uncovered whenever repairs to buildings or roads attempted. Portsmouth could not survive on the paltry commerce produced by the seasonal trade cycle of poverty-stricken renters and tourists. Students who arrived each October were replaced each July by coachloads of octogenarians in floral prints, hoping for an inexpensive holiday by the sea. During the last 3 weeks of each spring term, our landladies would be eager for us to be gone, willingless away with uncharacteristic impatience, because the senior citizens paid twice as much for each room as we did. Portsmouth was dependent for its economic health and employment of its residents upon the Portsmouth Naval Base, which had been an integral part of the city since 1194. The Royal Navy eventually occupied 3 miles of its waterfront and more than 296 acres of its city centre. From the windows of our lecture halls, we could set our minds adrift and gaze across the acres of destroyers, frigates, and minesweepers of Her Majesty's Royal Navy. I saw the ships, I saw the city, but I did not see anything. As Jamaica Kincaid puts it, I did not yet know the history of events. I did not know their antecedents. I had been schooled in the history of the heroes of the Royal Navy. I knew that Sir Francis Drake, circa 1540 to 1596, born as I was in the county of Devon, was a revered British hero, a founding father of British naval might, the most famous Vice Admiral of the British fleet, who led the attack on the Spanish Armada in 1588. I knew nothing about the Francis Drake, who, along with Sir John Hawkins, led the first slave trading expeditions, and then later supplemented his wealth through acts of piracy, plundering throughout the West Indies and South America. Both were knighted for their exploits. I did not know that at least 8 slave ships left Portsmouth between 1699 and 1711. While I studied literature and history in a city whose history I could not access, my education took place on streets that became very familiar to me. I learnt about the power of the state, not in my college classrooms, but in confrontation with the British riot police sent to guard 24 Grosvenor Square, London. I was the first in my family to go to college, or to regard the United States as anything other than the saviour of the free world. However, what I was learning during the protests against the Vietnam War had little, if anything, to do with American power, and everything to do with confronting the friendly British Bobby, whose mission was smiling and helping lost children, dogs, and the elderly, or so I had been taught. My brother and I were very young when we learnt that bobbies did not help nigger kids, black bastards, or half-caste scum. But my parents did not know this. My parents could not imagine that anyone, leave alone bobbies, saw my brother and I as half-caste scum. My respectable parents believed in teaching their respectable children, if you were ever lost or in trouble, find a policeman. Anyone who was afraid of the police, in their eyes, was not respectable and must have a reason to fear authority, presumably because they misbehaved. My parents had never witnessed a riot squad of bobbies on horseback, unleashed on people taking part in peaceful protest. But if they had witnessed this, if they had seen the swinging batons breaking heads, I do not know that they would have thought the police action wrong. My parents regarded what they called my antics outside the American embassy as more than foolish. My mother in particular felt that I was being disloyal, and that I was disloyal because my education was sorely lacking. I did not know what the British nation, and by implication I as an individual, owed to the people of the United States of America. The Americans didn't have to come all the way over here and put their lives at risk to help us during the war, she said again and again. These words were more than a reminder. They were issued as a warning, as if to say that when we needed the Americans again, they might not come the next time because of the behavior of ungrateful people like me. When I was in college, I actually worried about this. During World War II, my mother was a civil servant in the Air Ministry, and my father was a flight sergeant and wireless operator in the RAF. Persecuted and ostracized as a multiracial couple and lacking financial resources, education was their primary investment as a material legacy for their 2 children. Education was not just a path to financial security and social mobility. It was armor for their children. Sticks and stones will break your bones, but words will never harm you. And just be the best, be the first in your class, and they will leave you alone, were the phrases that resonated in the background of our school years. Were these words offered in comfort? Were these words offered as a protection? Did these words originate from the depths of my parents' bewilderment and frustration, from a profound ignorance of what to do? Or do these words offered as wisdom signal denial, a denial of how deeply racism was shaping post-war Britain? My brother and I had learnt the limited value of these offerings, of course. Words of hatred signalled imminent danger, often immediately preceding the sticks and stones that broke bones, or in my case, teeth. But when we were hurt, we told our parents that we'd had an accident. For admitting that we had been beaten meant that we were not trying hard enough, we were not good enough, and thus had let them down in some unfathomable way. My brother and I had a lot of accidents. Education in my family demanded endless sacrifice. We were removed from the local schools and sent to private schools. Was this move an unspoken recognition that we were suffering more than accidents? I do not know. My brother had a partial scholarship to his school, but my mother still had to work multiple jobs, day and night, for years to pay the fees. I'm convinced that my parents' belief in the promise and the transformative power of a British education was a measure of the depth of their faith in Britishness. My brother and I never witnessed the wavering of this faith. Not even when my father had to go to the Tottenham Court Road police station to obtain the release of my Dulwich Prep and Elaine's educated brother, who had been arrested and detained under the notorious Sus laws for walking along Oxford Street with a chequebook, assumed stolen, but actually his own, in his hand. You could say that I inherited an obsession with education, but I translated it into an entirely different political and intellectual agenda. Or did I? I certainly didn't have faith, but I retained my grasp on an endless list of questions. I registered for a postgraduate degree in education at the Institute of Education in London because I wanted to understand why the British educational system, instead of challenging inequalities of class and gender and race, actually preserved, reproduced, and promoted institutional racism as an integral part of class and gender divisions. At the end of the year, in my final examination, instead of responding to the questions asked, I wrote what I considered at the time to be a devastating analysis of the Institute's postgraduate program, as it completely ignored the issue of racism. I graduated with even more questions about the education system than those with which I had begun, but in fact I was then certified as an integral part of it. Who knows what happened to that paper after I literally stormed out of the examination room. But the next thing I knew, I was contacted by the Chief Education Officer of the London Borough of Newham and recruited to be part of an educational experiment in a newly formed high school in a sector of London with extremely low income and high unemployment. A single-sex school system was going co-ed for the first time, neo-Nazi gangs and the Cray brothers ruled the streets, and the area had a substantial Afro-Caribbean and Black British population. As I prepared for my first teaching job in August 1972, Idi Amin expelled British Asians from Uganda. Shocked and stunned, many of them found themselves in Newham, and their traumatized teenage sons and daughters I met in my classroom. My mother drove me to my first teaching job at Eastleigh High School in the East End of London, and she wept copious tears as she helped me move in to what she regarded as the slums. If this was the result of private schools and college degrees, if the fruit of her sacrifice was depositing me in an area of even deeper poverty than the poverty she had struggled so hard to climb out of and move away from, my mother wanted no part of it. I had accepted the position as an English teacher in Newham because I naively thought I could be part of fixing what was obviously broken. And I guess going to the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies at Birmingham University was another step in the same direction. I arrived at the centre an obnoxiously self-righteous, anti-racist activist in my 7th year as a high school teacher of English, on a fully paid sabbatical paid for by Newham. Into the corridors of CCCS, I carried the baggage of those years. A politics of the classroom forged in defence of the tenets and practices of progressive education against the insidious incursions of the Department of Education, led at that point by Maggie Thatcher, the milk snatcher. And also informed by a politics of the street honed in anti-racist battles waged against fascist gangs and their racist cousins in police uniform who patrolled our neighbourhood. While I learnt much from each of these struggles, They cost me little. However, I riffed upon them brazenly, elaborating them as street cred, to disguise how terrified and insecure I actually felt about being back and black in graduate school. I had worked in the vibrant and turbulent multiracial, multi-ethnic, unstreamed classrooms of a comprehensive school where a handful of us worked collectively in the hope that our pupils could be equal partners in the learning process. I saw how young minds and bodies opened under progressive, creative, and imaginative educational practices supported by generous resources. But in the midst of possibility, I also saw my black and brown students terrorized by violence and the threat of violence. Bricks were thrown through their windows as they slept. Feces and flaming bottles full of petrol were pushed through their letterboxes. And to get to and from school or the shops, they were pushed and shoved or punched and beaten as they passed by the racist slogans daubed all over the walls, the doors, and the streets of our neighborhood. At any hour of any day, they could be subject to physical and mental abuse, in or out of school, from their peers, from shopkeepers, from the police, and from the social service workers appointed to assist them. To be of any use to these students, my classroom had to be transformed into a safe place, but also a laboratory for the forensic examination of racist encounters and for the translation of analysis into practical strategies for countering and overcoming the effects of institutional racism. When I applied to the centre, I had a much-thumbed copy of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed on my bedside table, a text which informed my practice in my high school and in the adult literacy program that I ran 2 evenings a week in the same building. I had also assembled a growing library of books and papers published by CCCS, including Resistance Through Rituals and On Ideology. Exhausted at the end of the day, in moments stolen from grading papers or working on lesson plans, or during a weekend when I wasn't taking my form on a camping trip or to the theatre, I read with diligence and care what was being written at the centre. I was eager for an intellectual challenge, although I sometimes found the reading difficult and occasionally impenetrable, but I never doubted that the effort was worth it. Even though I hadn't yet met any of the members of CCCS, I regarded them as allies in the fight against the increasingly authoritarian and conservative forces being mobilized against the poor, the working class, the black, and the immigrant. In short, against everyone in my world. I devoured the insights which addressed our condition in an area with high levels of unemployment, imprisonment, immigration, inadequate housing, and racism, and very low income levels. CCS publications, I thought, contained analyses with which one could begin to develop defensive strategies and to imagine the construction of paths to a just and equitable world. The interview that followed my application to the centre terrified me, but the letter offering me a place terrified me even more. I was afraid that I would be unable to translate the knowledge I carried with me into what I regarded as the theoretically sophisticated world of CCCS. Before I left Newham, I had carefully explained to my students that I was going to the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies for a year to study and to get a master's degree, and they all seemed to understand and applaud my reasons and motives. When I met 5 or 6 of them outside the butcher's shop around the corner from my flat in Forest Gate after my first term in Birmingham, they were really pleased to see me and we chatted for ages. But gradually they revealed some doubts about my rate of progress. They were curious to exactly how hard I had been studying, and they asked if I was sure that I could pass my exams at the end of the year. Eventually it dawned on me that the cause of their concern derived from the fact that my manner of speaking had not improved in their eyes, despite the months that had been spent studying culture. Only gradually did I understand the terms of their equation. For my students, cultural studies translated into becoming cultured, and being cultured meant sounding like a BBC broadcaster. Culture, then, was the means by which I was to acquire class mobility, class position in Britain being recognised and confirmed through accent. My failure to make progress was registered in my voice, and much was at stake in my evident lack of success. If I hadn't learnt to speak differently, how on earth was I going to be able to return to teach them or their children how to be cultured and thus upwardly mobile? If I didn't make it, they didn't either. The year before this conversation, during my last year as their teacher, we had taken a class trip, not one of our major expeditions, just a walk down the road to the office of the London Docklands Development Corporation in the last class period of the day. There we walked around and between tables on which lay detailed models of the future of where we lived. Gone were the familiar shabby streets, decaying high-rises and council flats. The voices of my pupils, usually loud, well, very loud actually, energetic and buoyant, were hushed. Their almost whispers a measure of a certain awe and respect, if not of comprehension. I stood apart from them, leaning against the wall, strictly an observer, for I had visited this office before. I had seen the display, and I recognised what it meant for the residents of the area. I didn't have the heart to translate it for them. I wanted them to see and understand for themselves what was coming. "It's beautiful," I heard one say, followed by, "Which of these houses do you want?" "Oh, I want this one right here on the canal." "Oh, I don't, it's too close to the water." Pause. "Why does the water go right under the side of these houses?" "So you can keep your boat in there, stupid." "But my mum doesn't have a boat." Silence was followed by gradual realization. First, they understood that these houses were not for people who didn't have boats, and especially not for people who couldn't even imagine owning a boat. Then they saw that redevelopment was not for them, that people like them were not to be included in the rosy image of the future docklands. How many of them knew that people like them were expendable and would inevitably be displaced, I don't know. The volume of their voices rose to their normal levels. They glanced out of the corner of their eyes, trying not to read in my face explanations that they didn't want to hear. Without being prompted, they collectively turned their backs on the tables, gathered their jackets and bags, and moved to the door ready to move. In a discordant chorus of voices, each of them announced other places they had to be. A year later, outside the butcher's, as my students searched my face, another hope, the one they had eagerly placed in their teacher, bit the dust. 1978 to 1984, the years I was associated with CCCS, completing first an MA and then the PhD, which produced the study Reconstructing Womanhood, were years of seemingly inexhaustible intellectual energy, passionate commitment, and political vision. Pessimism of the intellect, a response to the rapidly increasing state authoritarianism, the brutal effects of everyday racism and gender inequality, and what appeared to be the continual defeat of left and progressive agendas, was countered by an optimism of the will exercised in intellectual activity in the service of social, political, and economic transformation. But I am, to this day, haunted by the loss of the students I left behind. Memory often strikes me as a kind of dumbness. It makes one's head heavy and giddy, as if one were not looking back down the receding perspectives of time, but rather down on the earth from a great height, from one of those towers whose tops are lost to view in the clouds. W.G. Sebald, The Emigrants. In the process of writing Child of Empire, I have read parts of it to audiences in Britain and the UK. This may have been a mistake, because I'm increasingly aware of addressing particular responses in advance. It is the response of many Americans to the story of my parents' interracial wartime liaison, which has surprised and dismayed me. In the United States, audiences seem to expect, if not demand, that I deliver a fully fledged romance with all the trimmings. A tale of a love that triumphed against tremendous odds. Starring a couple that resemble a youthful Sidney Poitier and a starry-eyed Veronica Lake. Americans who have never actually met my parents interpret and project a romance evolving in a time of war, a romance triumphal despite British governmental and military attempts to impose segregation, to stop black men fraternizing with white women, a romance that blossomed into a marriage in the face of national anxiety about the consequences of the birth of half-caste citizens. A project originally conceived as a confrontation and reckoning with the long tradition of racist thought and practice in Britain has evolved into an act of translation. And I now write also to repudiate romance. The romance US audiences have with the British Isles, and the romance that the story of race has become in the United States. I write in defiance of both masterpiece theatre and the hallmark hug of comfort that seems necessary to cushion a US readership against the shock of discovering that the British are racist. Romance not only comforts and cushions, it disguises and represses. Black and white sex, while it can still shock and horrify Americans in the street, also serves as a metonym for the history of the unresolved struggle for racial justice in the United States. I asked myself if the desires and whims of current times are evident in the need for the relationship between a Jamaican airman and a Welsh civil servant to stand as a racial romance. The popular cultural script of romance and its academic theoretical counterpart, post-colonial theories of hybridity, promise progress through creolization, a fluid utopia of possibility flying in the face of pastness, fixture, and regression. But for me, a large part of what it meant to be a child of empire was watching two people confront the stomach-churning, acidic, corrosive effects of racism every day and being destroyed by it. Perhaps if my parents had been middle class and wealthy, they would have been less affected by the blows of ignorance and prejudice. Perhaps. Growing up in South London in the racial tensions and anxieties of post-World War II Britain was nothing like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. It was an acidic rain that fell on my parents' parade and eroded all possibility of affection. From the moment they met during World War II, they must have realized they were courting danger. Rebelling against racialized codes of behavior and flaunting that rebellion in the face of friends and family must have stimulated the passion of their sexual attraction into a heady measure of frisson impossible for them to rationalize or for me to dissect and analyze into discrete segments of affect. The marriage of my parents was not a romantic union, but a step into purgatory. Crossing the lines of acceptable British conduct, breaking racial and sexual taboos did not fuse them into a couple, but drew them apart and eventually bound them into mutual emotional isolation. The question how life could and should be lived in the face of external antagonism outside our four walls was never discussed, but turned the house into a pressure cooker. The racialized and gendered beliefs, practices, and prejudices of the British social and political order made the social, economic, and political circumstances of our lives very difficult. But within those circumstances, my parents failed or did not care to listen, to know, or to understand one another. They were strangers then, and strangers they remained throughout the years of marriage and parenting. My younger brother and I had to navigate our way around, through, and over currents of violence. The magma flow that hardened into the core of their relationship. We came to fear the night when one or the other of us tumbled or were pulled, often out of bed, into the maelstrom of their wrath. When they were spent, we were left to drag ourselves out of the ashes and the glowing embers of their fury, to lick our wounds alone. Wounds of childhood, scabbed over, toughened, but unhealed. If much of the pleasure of research lies in the process of detection, identifying clues and tracking down leads, if not suspects, delving into the lives of my parents, I have become less like a detective assembling details into a recognizable pattern of events with discernible causes and effects, and more like a moth flying toward the open flame of their seething resentments. The rewriting of the past is fueled by temptation, the lure of revelation, the possibility of creating reason out of unreason, the hope of harvesting knowledge from the bleak years of the British post-war world. My career is my flame-proof bodysuit, the retardant, skills honed in research, sprayed on a surface toughened with Marxist and feminist theory. All moths are convinced of their invulnerability. They do not deviate when they feel the heat, and they do not hesitate as they head into the flame. Thank you.
question that kind of I'm inviting you to respond to is, has the combination of those two facts influenced your capacity to, now let's say, the fact that you've had to come to the US to do your work, and maybe you wouldn't say you've had to come, but the fact that you've had a career in the US, do you think it would have been possible to do the work you're doing, perhaps in relation to black women in Britain, in the context of the education system in Britain and the kind of forgetting of empire?
Right. Ronaldo mentioned the text, "The Empire Strikes Back." I think what he may not know, well, I'm not sure whether he knows it or whether you all know it or not, is that that text actually made Errol Lawrence and Paul Gilroy and I unemployable in the British Academy. Paul Gilroy went to work for the London Council for a long time, actually in a sort of police overview, and it took him a long time to get back to the Academy. Margaret Thatcher's response was, we're not having any of that black power stuff here. And there were very material effects, actually. I was the last person to be given a fellowship to the centre. The centre became a place where no funded work would happen. And in fact, work on race was to be funded through the Home Office to certain universities designated as places where that was supposed to happen. I mean, over the years, those things have changed, but what I'm saying is that was the response at the time. So actually, when I met Charles Davis, and he knew about the work I was doing in the British Library on those early slave narratives by women, the chance to sort of come here and to work as a student among a whole range of people was one that opened up a way into the academy that I couldn't actually have had at that time in the UK. So, it's been interesting to see how things have transformed, but also in some ways how some things have stayed the same. Because that paradox, the remembering and the forgetting, completely shapes the whole year of the apparent commemoration of the abolition of the slave trade. You can see this, that the paradox sort of remains. But it also remains in what I was trying to suggest about the romance of the US with the British Isles, because the apologists like Niall Ferguson for empire, do you see what I mean, are sort of like lauded. The whole argument about, it wasn't so bad, actually did an awful lot of good things, is one that many people over here are sort of very eager to hear. So it has, the paradox remains, but the paradox to me has always been one that it's very fruitful to navigate. And I tried to get my students to understand that. Even in high school, taking them to the library and actually getting them to look up in the history books, when I was a high school English teacher, the word slavery. And all the books were slavery, abolition of. There was, it was a total erasure that there had ever been anything else. It was just the same sort of narrative of saving the rest of the world. But in a way, it's precisely that paradox that was a way to begin, to open up what needed to be thought in terms of that other journey that it was absolutely necessary to take. Everybody's really tired.
To sink in. Well, I'm sure they'll come over wine and food.
I'm very happy to answer any questions with a glass of wine.
Yeah.
So thanks everyone for coming out.